The morning air was crisp, the scent of damp grass lingering from the night's rain. Sheriff Jake Carter sat on his porch, savoring the rare piece of his day off. His fingers wrapped around a warm coffee mug, steam curling in the cool air. Birds chirped in the distance, the hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street adding to the lazy rhythm of the neighborhood. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the stillness settle over him. Days like this were a rarity, a small pocket of calm in a job filled with chaos. Then came the knock. Loud. Unnecessarily aggressive. Jake's eyes snapped open. His instincts, honed from years of law enforcement, prickled with unease. He wasn't expecting visitors and he certainly wasn't expecting trouble. Setting his coffee down, he rose from his chair and made his way to the front door. Another knock, this time more insistent. The moment he pulled the door open, his suspicion turned into something closer to amusement. 3 men stood on his doorstep, clad in cheap, navy blue uniforms that looked like something from a low-budget costume shop. Badges, plastic by the look of them, gleamed under the morning light, pinned proudly to their chests. The man in the center, tall with slicked-back hair and the kind of smug expression Jake had seen on every 2-bit con artist he'd ever arrested, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," the man announced, voice dripping with self-importance. "We have a problem." Jake leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Do we now?" The man's smirk widened as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "I'm Richard Grayson, president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association." He gestured toward the men flanking him. "And these are my officers. We're here on official HOA business." Jake arched a brow, glancing at the so-called officers. The one on the left, a wiry guy with an overgrown mustache, shifted his weight uncomfortably. The other, a beefy man with a buzz cut, kept his gaze locked forward, jaw tight. They were trying to look official, but their stiff postures and ill-fitting uniforms betrayed them. "Official business, huh?" Jake drawled, tilting his head. "You knock like you're serving a warrant. So, tell me what's this about?" Richard pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it up like it was a royal decree. "You've violated HOA regulations," he said, tone thick with exaggerated authority. "We have reason to believe you are unlawfully storing a prohibited vehicle on your property." Jake didn't bother to hide his smirk. "You mean my patrol car?" Richard's eyes flickered with something close to satisfaction. "Ah, so you admit it." He unfolded the paper with a dramatic flourish. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3, residents may not park unauthorized vehicles in driveways or along neighborhood streets. All non-compliant vehicles must be removed immediately or face appropriate disciplinary action. Jake sighed, rubbing his temple. "That's a county-issued vehicle. Authorized by the state of—" "It doesn't matter," Richard interrupted. "HOA rules supersede county ordinances within Maplewood. You're in direct violation and as such, we are left with no choice but to take appropriate action." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Appropriate action? And what exactly does that mean?" The grin Richard gave him was slow, deliberate. "Arrest." Silence. For half a second, Jake thought he had misheard him. But then the 2 men beside Richard shifted, their hands hovering over the cheap handcuffs clipped to their belts. "Excuse me?" Jake asked, his voice deceptively calm. Richard straightened his shoulders. "As an official enforcement body of the Maplewood HOA, we are within our rights to detain individuals who fail to comply with our regulations." Jake blinked. "You're joking." "Not at all," Richard replied smoothly. "We take violations very seriously. And unfortunately for you, Sheriff, we don't make exceptions for anyone. Not even law enforcement." The sheer absurdity of it nearly made Jake laugh. Nearly. But there was something in Richard's gaze that stopped him, something beyond arrogance. This wasn't just a show of power. This man truly believed he had the authority to enforce his made-up laws. Jake exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. "All right," he said, voice light. "Let's say I go along with this. Let's say I let you arrest me. What then?" Richard's smirk widened. "We'll escort you to our designated holding area for processing, and you'll be required to attend a disciplinary hearing with the HOA board." Jake's patience, already paper-thin, snapped entirely. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You listen to me and you listen good," he said, voice dropping into a quiet, dangerous tone. "You are impersonating law enforcement. That's a felony. You and your little officers here are about 5 seconds away from real handcuffs and a ride to the county jail." For the first time, Richard faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but just as quickly he recovered, straightening. "You can't intimidate me, Sheriff. We know our rights. Jake smiled, slow and sharp. Oh, I bet you do. You know what else? I'd love to hear all about them, down at the station. Maybe after you spend a few hours in a holding cell, you'll remember that HOA regulations don't override state law. Buzzcut twitched. Mustache looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. But Richard, stubborn and foolish, doubled down. This isn't over, he snapped. We have the authority to handle violations as we see fit. If you resist, we'll escalate matters. Jake stepped even closer, forcing Richard to tilt his head back. You want to escalate? He asked softly. Go ahead. But just know if you so much as touch me, that's assault on an officer. And I don't think your little costume squad is prepared for the consequences of that. The street was silent. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them, thick and suffocating. Then finally Richard took a slow step back. Fine, he sneered. Have it your way. But this isn't over, Sheriff. Jake tilted his head. Oh, I know it's not. Richard turned on his heel, stalking back down the driveway. His two goons hesitated before scurrying after him. They climbed into a black SUV, slamming the doors shut. The engine revved, tires screeching against the pavement as they sped off. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. He had dealt with a lot of entitled people in his career, but this was something else entirely. He picked up his coffee cup from the porch railing, took a sip and muttered under his breath. Well, this just got interesting. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement as Jake sat on his porch, watching the neighborhood settle back into its usual rhythm. The ridiculousness of what had just transpired gnawed at him, but something deeper stirred beneath his irritation, unease. Richard and his so-called officers hadn't just been posturing. They had been serious. The way Richard spoke, the way he carried himself, he wasn't a man who took no for an answer. Jake had encountered men like him before. Self-important. Entitled. Dangerous not because of any real power but because they believed they had it. That kind of delusion made people reckless. The thought barely had time to settle before the sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. He turned his head just as a neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson, shuffled up the walkway, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Morning, Sheriff, she greeted, her voice hushed. I saw what happened earlier. Jake offered a half-smile. Didn't take long for word to spread, huh? Mrs. Henderson worried the strap of her purse, her knuckles white. Richard's been getting worse, Jake. Ever since he got re-elected as HOA president last year, he's been acting like he runs a dictatorship. He's been fining people left and right, shutting down yard sales, banning holiday decorations. She paused, lowering her voice. Last month he had old Mr. Kowalski's car towed right out of his driveway. Poor man had to pay $600 just to get it back. Jake's jaw tightened. He had suspected Richard was overstepping his authority, but this was something else entirely. Has anyone reported him? Mrs. Henderson let out a humorless laugh. To who? The HOA board is filled with his friends. Anyone who speaks up gets hit with violations until they fall in line. He even threatened to have my daughter's dog taken away for excessive barking. The dog is 12 years old and half deaf, Jake. Jake exhaled slowly, scanning the street. Looked normal. Too normal. Neighbors tending to their yards, cars pulling in and out of driveways, kids riding their bikes. But there was an underlying tension he hadn't noticed before. Furtive glances, stiff shoulders, the way conversations halted when certain cars drove past. Richard had his fingers wrapped around this community like a vice. And now, he had just made the mistake of trying to flex that control on the wrong person. A low rumble of an engine cut through the stillness. Jake looked up, watching as the black SUV from earlier rolled down the street at an almost deliberate pace. It slowed as it reached his house, the tinted window rolling down just enough for him to see Richard's smug face behind the wheel. Enjoying your coffee, Sheriff? Richard called out, voice thick with amusement. Jake didn't move from his chair. Something I can help you with, Richard? The SUV came to a complete stop in front of the driveway. I just wanted to give you one last chance to cooperate before things get inconvenient for you. Jake tilted his head. That a threat? Richard grinned, shaking his head. No, just a friendly warning. You see, the HOA is meeting tonight for an emergency session. We'll be discussing your repeated violations, and I wouldn't be surprised if some very steep fines come your way. And if those fines aren't paid. He spread his hands, shrugging. Well, we both know what happens then. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Let me get this straight. You tried to have me arrested for parking my patrol car in my own driveway, and now you think slapping me with some fake fines is going to intimidate me? Richard's expression didn't waver. I don't need to intimidate you, Sheriff. I just need to make things difficult. After all, I control the neighborhood's approval processes. Renovations, lawn permits, even trash collection schedules. It would be a shame if mistakes were made in the system. Garbage piling up, delays in service, minor inconveniences that could quickly become major headaches. Jake let the words hang in the air between them. You don't strike me as a man who likes bureaucracy, Richard continued. A mountain of paperwork, endless disputes, is all of that really worth it? Wouldn't it just be easier to move your car and let this go? Jake smiled. You know, Richard, I was willing to ignore your little stunt this morning. Chalk it up to an overzealous HOA president with too much time on his hands. But now, he rested back against his chair, stretching his legs out. Now I'm interested. Richard's smile faltered. Interested? Jake nodded. Yeah. See, when people start throwing around threats disguised as friendly warnings, that usually means there's something bigger going on. Something they don't want other people looking into. He gestured toward the street. And I gotta say, the way my neighbors have been looking over their shoulders lately, it tells me you've been making a lot of these friendly warnings. Richard's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. You're making a mistake, Sheriff. No, Jake said, standing up. I think you did. A long silence stretched between them. Richard's confident smirk flickered just for a second, but he quickly masked it. Without another word, he rolled up the window and drove off, his SUV disappearing around the corner. Jake let out a slow breath, his mind already piecing things together. Richard wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. He was a man used to getting his way through intimidation and manipulation. The problem was he just tried to use those tactics on a sheriff. And now Jake was very interested in what else Richard was hiding. The Maplewood Community Center buzzed with quiet conversation as homeowners trickled into the meeting room, their voices hushed, their eyes wary. The fluorescent lights cast a dull glow over the rows of chairs, each occupied by a resident who had long since learned that these meetings were less about discussion and more about Richard Grayson reinforcing his control. At the head of the room, Richard stood behind a wooden podium, his fingers drumming against the surface with practiced patience. His usual smugness was amplified tonight, his posture oozing confidence as he watched the last few attendees settle into their seats. Beside him, the other HOA board members sat like a panel of judges, each one carefully selected for their willingness to nod in agreement with whatever Richard dictated. Jake had arrived early, taking a seat near the back where he could observe without drawing too much attention. But it didn't take long for Richard to notice him. Their eyes met across the room, and for the briefest second, something flickered in Richard's gaze, something calculating. All right, let's get started, Richard announced, tapping the microphone for effect. Thank you all for coming to this emergency session of the Maplewood Homeowners Association. We have a rather serious matter to discuss tonight, one that concerns the integrity of our community. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Jake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He already knew exactly where this was going. Richard took a slow breath as if what he was about to say pained him. It has come to our attention that one of our residents has been in repeated violation of our neighborhood regulations. Despite multiple warnings, this individual has refused to comply, leaving us with no choice but to take action. He let the words sink in before turning his gaze toward Jake. Sheriff Carter, would you like to stand and explain to your neighbors why you believe you're above the rules? Jake didn't move, didn't react to the bait. He let the silence stretch until the discomfort settled over the room like a heavy fog. Then finally he rose to his feet, his chair scraping against the tile. Sure, he said, voice calm. I'd be happy to explain. Richard smirked as if he'd already won. Jake took his time walking toward the front of the room, hands in his pockets, his pace unhurried. See, when Richard and his goons showed up at my house this morning, they didn't just ask me to move my car. They tried to arrest me. In my own driveway. On my day off. He let out a soft chuckle. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but last I checked, an HOA doesn't have the authority to detain people. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. A few whispers. A few furrowed brows. Richard cleared his throat. That's not exactly what happened. Jake turned to face him. No? Because I distinctly remember two men in fake uniforms reaching for their handcuffs while you stood there threatening me with disciplinary action. He shifted his attention to the audience. Now, I understand that HOAs have rules. I respect that. But here's what I don't respect. Intimidation, harassment, and abuse of power. And from what I've been hearing around the neighborhood, Richard here has been doing all three for a long time. The murmurs grew louder. A woman near the front turned to her husband, whispering something urgent. A man in the middle row frowned, nodding in agreement. Richard held up a hand. "Let's not get distracted," he said smoothly. "Sheriff Carter is attempting to divert attention away from the real issue. His vehicle is a violation of our regulations, and as HOA president, it's my duty to enforce those rules." Jake let the statement hang in the air before pulling a folded document from his back pocket. "Funny thing about that," he said, unfolding the paper. "I did a little research before coming here tonight. Turns out, Maplewood's original HOA charter doesn't actually grant the board the authority to enforce fines on vehicles with government-issued plates. It also doesn't give you the power to threaten homeowners with legal action, nor does it allow you to fabricate official enforcement officers to carry out your orders." Richard's smile stiffened. "That information is outdated." Jake tilted his head. "Oh? Because I pulled it directly from the county's public records office this afternoon. It's all right here in black and white. So either you're incompetent at your job, or you've been knowingly violating the HOA's own rules." The energy in the room shifted. Conversations turned heated, voices rising. "Wait, is that true?" someone demanded. "I paid $300 last month for a parking violation," another resident snapped. "Why didn't we know about this?" Richard's composure wavered for the first time. "This meeting is not the place for baseless accusations," he said sharply. Jake took another step closer. "Then let's talk about something that isn't baseless. Like how you've been funneling HOA funds into a private account." The room went deathly silent. Richard's face lost its color. "That's..." "I pulled the financial statements too," Jake continued, holding up another document. "The numbers don't add up. Large withdrawals labeled as community improvements, but no actual records of any work being done. Payments made to companies that don't exist. And oh, look at that, multiple transactions that just happen to lead back to a bank account in your name." A woman near the front gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. "You've been stealing from us?" a man bellowed. Richard's hand clenched the podium. "I don't have to stand here and listen to these lies." Jake smiled, slow and sharp. "That's fine. You can explain it all to the real authorities." He pulled out his phone, flipping the screen toward Richard. "See, I figured you'd try to worm your way out of this. So I made a little call before I got here." The sound of approaching sirens sliced through the tension. Richard's face twisted, his mask of control crumbling. He turned ready to bolt, but it was too late. The front doors burst open, uniformed officers flooding inside. The residents watched in stunned silence as two deputies marched forward, their expressions unreadable. "Richard Grayson," one of them announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement and impersonating law enforcement." The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others cheered. Mrs. Henderson, seated in the middle row, clapped her hands together with an audible "about time." Jake stepped back, watching as Richard sputtered, his arrogance replaced with sheer panic. The deputies hauled him away, his protests drowned out by the roar of an angry, liberated crowd. Jake turned toward the homeowners, offering a small nod. Meeting adjourned. The moment Richard was dragged from the room, the air inside the community center shifted. It was as if a spell had been broken, like a dense fog had finally lifted. The neighbors, once hesitant and fearful, now whispered to one another in a rush of disbelief and exhilaration. Some shook their heads in stunned silence. Others grinned, the weight of years of frustration melting away. Jake watched it all unfold, his trained instincts catching every flicker of emotion crossing the faces of the homeowners. There was anger, relief, and something even more satisfying, vindication. These people had lived under Richard's rule for too long, bending to his will out of fear of retaliation. But now, for the first time, they realized they were free. A few of the board members, previously so eager to sit by Richard's side, now sat frozen in their chairs, shifting uncomfortably. The moment the officers escorted Richard out, the illusion of their authority crumbled. Without their leader, they were exposed, vulnerable. Jake didn't let them off the hook so easily. He strode toward the podium, his steps slow and deliberate, commanding the room's attention without having to say a word. The murmuring hushed as every set of eyes turned to him. "Well," he said, sliding his hands into his pockets, "that was more entertaining than I expected." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but it quickly faded, replaced by curiosity. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but urgent. One of the board members, a wiry man named Allen, cleared his throat. "Sheriff Carter, what happens now?" Jake arched a brow. "Now? Now Richard faces the consequences of his actions. Fraud. Embezzlement. Impersonating law enforcement. He won't be terrorizing this neighborhood anymore. He let his gaze sweep across the remaining board members, letting his words settle. And anyone else who had a hand in his little scheme might want to come clean before the investigation digs too deep. A woman near the front, a younger resident who had moved in only a year ago, crossed her arms. So what happens to the HOA? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. They all had the same thought. With Richard gone, what now? Jake leaned against the podium. That's up to you, he said simply. Richard built his power on fear, on making sure no one spoke out. But that only works if people let it. He glanced around the room, making sure to meet as many eyes as possible. This community doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to all of you. If you want change, you have to take it. Mrs. Henderson, standing near the back, lifted her chin. I say we dissolve the whole damn thing. That set off a fresh wave of murmurs. Some nodded enthusiastically. Others looked hesitant. Jake wasn't here to tell them what to do, but he could give them the push they needed. At the very least, you're gonna need new leadership. People who actually care about this neighborhood instead of lining their pockets. He turned his gaze to the remaining board members, watching as they squirmed under the scrutiny. I'd start there. Alan swallowed hard, dabbing at the sweat on his forehead. We can discuss a new election. Mrs. Henderson scoffed. Not with you still in charge. Another voice, this one from an older man near the back, spoke up. I agree. We need a fresh start. People we can trust. A younger man, no older than 30, frowned. And what about the money Richard stole? Can we get that back? Jake nodded. That'll be up to the courts, but I can tell you this. Anyone who paid fines under Richard's made-up rules? You've got a case to get reimbursed. That sparked another round of conversation. Hope crept into people's voices now, the weight of Richard's tyranny slowly peeling away. Jake let them talk, stepping back as the discussion turned toward action. He had done what he came to do. The real battle belonged to the people of Maplewood now. As he turned toward the door, a hand caught his arm. He looked down to find Mrs. Henderson, her eyes crinkling with gratitude. Thank you, Jake, she said softly. We needed this. He gave her a small smile. You never needed me, Mrs. Henderson. You just needed to remember that Richard only had power because you let him. She nodded, squeezing his arm before letting him go. Jake stepped outside into the cool night air, inhaling deeply. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cars painted streaks across the quiet street, but the chaos from earlier had settled. Richard was gone. Justice had been set in motion. As he made his way back toward his truck, he spotted one of the younger residents. Mark, if he remembered right, standing near the curb, staring at his phone with wide eyes. Jake stopped. Something wrong? Mark turned the screen toward him, and Jake's lips quirked up in amusement. Richard's arrest was already trending. Someone had recorded the entire ordeal inside the meeting, and now social media was ablaze with the downfall of the fake HOA cop. The comments were brutal. Memes were already circulating. One in particular stood out, a screenshot of Richard being hauled away, captioned, "When you try to arrest a real sheriff but karma arrests you instead." Jake let out a low chuckle. Looks like your neighborhood's about to get famous. Mark grinned. Best thing that's ever happened to it. With a satisfied nod, Jake climbed into his truck. As he started the engine, he cast one last glance toward the community center, where voices still carried into the night. The people of Maplewood had been silenced for too long. But now they had found their voices again.